Welcome, everybody, to this month's Lunch and Learn, where Terry and I are going to be tackling the topic of leadership. And I always like to start discussions on leadership with questions of definition. And I'd love to ask Terry, how do you define leadership?
You know what? I like John Maxwell's definition, and since John's the kind of the premier leadership guy on the planet at the moment, it seems fitting. He says the leader is a person who knows the way and shows the way. For me, I'm an individual that believes every one of us has the ability to lead. We just have to choose to do so. If you look at an organizational chart, it doesn't matter if we're talking the executive suite or if we're talking the receptionist, with the exception of maybe a project leader or a team leader, you rarely see the word leader in an organizational chart. So I believe everyone has the ability to step up and lead at any time on every topic.
I love that leadership is not title, but it's more action for me. So I always think about leadership as, sort of taking ownership and supporting, I guess, the team, being able to, without a team, is it still leadership? That's always the question. Can I be a team lead without a team? I don't know how that really goes, but taking leadership for me is really taking ownership, action, and accountability. But also, one of the things that I think with leadership is one of the highest priorities of a leader is to help the team grow and to help them to achieve balance, which is where behavioral elements comes in. So, team in the audience here, if you want to share what your definition of leadership is or how you perceive leadership, it'd be great to get some ideas going here because everybody kind of walks into these discussions with just a little bit different sort of look at the leadership lens. So, Terry, we're going to talk today about behavioral elements and leadership. And why don't you kick us off with if you're thinking about leading people, why is it, for you, what becomes important about understanding sort of like their drives and what drives them?
I think number one is you have to meet people where they are. And I think behavioral elements is such a roadmap to be able to understand that because ultimately, great leaders, yeah, maybe they get some more followers, but their goal is to create more leaders, right? And so, to help understand what motivates someone, what gets them in the mood, so to speak, and makes them take the appropriate action is fundamental in leadership. And then what I like about how behavioral elements ties in is communication is the core of any good relationship. And without a relationship with the people that are quote unquote following you, they're not going to let you lead them. So the communication knowledge that we gain through behavioral elements, meaning specifically how do we communicate with each of the elements so it actually meets them, so we have shared meaning, so we understand each other before we split ways, is so powerful. That's what I love about it, and we'll talk more about that in a minute because as an heir, I've got all kinds of examples of thinking, oh, I was super clear, and then finding out that nothing happened after the fact.
Well, and that's a big challenge, right? Because leadership is about getting behavioral change or behavioral movement, some kind of form of action from the team. I see Sarah added into the chat leadership's taken the step forward into uncertainty and then reach back and lend a hand to those following you to help them navigate the way, not just leaving them in the dust and not looking back. I love that. And I'm going to use that so as most people know, I am an extremely high fire with air as my secondary and very low earth and not quite as low water, but still below the line of balance. And one of the things that I remember and I recall many, many years ago, was when I was taking leadership positions, I was burning my teams out. And part of the reason is because the way that I was approaching leadership. New idea, let's do it. Let's go. Let's run. Let's do it. Oh, another idea? Yeah, let's do that too. And then all of a sudden, we've got 45 different projects on the docket, and the team's going, whoa, 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 slow down. And I never understood it. And actually, I mean, at the very beginning, I was questioning. I'm like, did I pick the right team for this? Was I? And I didn't actually turn that sort of like perception inwards and say, am I not leading the team with balance? And that was such an eye-opening experience for me, is that people were not going to come to the same problems, projects, or even actions in the exact same way. So that has been something that's really helped me understand, okay, why am I burning my team out? Or why is my team getting frustrated with me from that leadership perspective? Have you had any of those experiences? You mentioned your high air, kind of dive into that a little bit, Terry.
So I wanna decode a little bit about what you said first, and then I will, right? So your high air, right, your secondary element allows you to ideate and create and innovate and bring up new ideas that your fire says, we have to make this happen now. This is how we win, gang. And so the ideation happens, and you want the implementation to happen just right now. And so from a non air person or a non-fire person, they're not going to be able to keep up, right? Especially if you're dumping some of that onto someone who compliments you and has a high earth. They're like, yo, sunshine, this has got to get into my process. And yoink, it ain't time for that yet. And so it's important to understand and really to break it down enough that we've got that shared meaning. As far as I go, I'm so passionate and so excited about any idea as an air guy that, one of the characteristics of air is that transfer of enthusiasm. We could get people all kinds of fired up, at least temporarily, but we're explaining it at such a high level that if we don't specifically connect the dots for them and give the tasks and the priorities in an order that is easy to follow, especially for the earth type and the water type, they're going to just nod and agree. And then when you walk away, they're going to go right back to what the heck they were doing. And that's happened to me. Well, let's call it frequently. I move quick, man. I want to get stuff done, or I don't want to move at all, right? I want to go back into thought mode. So that's where it shows up for me a lot.
Well, and I think it's important to remember, right? When we look at the BE wheel, air and fire, both at the top, are unstructured. They don't want to necessarily be bound by something. They don't want to have to say, okay, well, this is how we did it yesterday. We need to repeat those results or do these different things. It's very unstructured in its approach, but that can be really jarring to your team, who feels like all of that lack of structure is making it hard to plan, making it hard to execute, making it hard to get repeatable, reliable results. And through behavioral elements was really where I started to learn is leadership requires balance. And I'll give an example of this. One of the sales leaders that I was doing some coaching with this organization, they were super high fire, as you could probably imagine, but they came in with that attitude of, okay, pick up the phone, smile and dial, get out there, sell, 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 sell. Well, interestingly enough, their HR department was not fire, and ultimately created connections with a number of different salespeople that they hired that had more structure. They were far more water, they were far more earth, which is pretty consistent with HR. So when this fire leader came in and started demanding that everybody, sell, 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 hit these goals, hit these quotas, that just did not motivate the team. And in fact, that next quarter, their sales went down. And a big part of that was not being able to connect with people where they were at, much like you said.
Yeah, and it's that to me is the key, right? Like taking the time to understand the goals and the objectives of your team, not just for this quarter's performance, but like 360 degrees of them, um, that's a really watery thing, right? To care, to be empathetic, to understand, to take that time and that energy and to breathe into other people. And we've discussed in other episodes that a lot of times the fires, the element that rises to the top because of that drive to win, that competitive nature. And unless these fire folks do what you've done, masterfully, might I add, figure out how to add that element of water into your world, burnout, turnover, revolving door are the outcomes that you're just going to continue to see. And you're going to still go, well, these guys suck. Couldn't possibly be me, because you're not aware of how you're showing up.
Yep, nope, that's absolutely true. And I see Jennifer put in the comments, I'm a high flyer. I have to intentionally ask for input because I often charge forward without asking others. I feel you. I see you. I value you, Jennifer. Here is one of the tactics that I started to do in order to sort of manage that in myself. I realized like I was putting people on the spot from a leadership perspective. We'd be in a meeting, I'd have an idea, and I'd be like, Terry, what do you think on this? Let's go. And I realized that, maybe somebody with a high air or that lack of structure is going to be far more comfortable spitting out ideas, brainstorming. One of the ways that I approach things now is that if I do bring up an idea or a concept, I generally give myself a deadline for people to respond. So, like if I'm sending something out, I say, I'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback on this. Could you get back to me by Thursday? That really kind of keeps me in line of saying, not everybody is going to respond as quickly as I do. Secondly, it gives a priority or a deadline, based on how urgent it might be. But the third thing, and this is what I really realized, is it gave me time to reflect on that same question. Because in many cases, I wasn't spending time evaluating my own ideas or evaluating which direction. It was just like, good idea. Yeah, seems like a good idea. Let's go. So when I was offering that and kind of creating that little bit of space, it wasn't just for the other people, but it was for me to slow down and say, all right, now I've got a little time to reflect on this. Sometimes by the time I got to Thursday, I'm like, all right, I've already had 6 new iterations of this. Let's rethink this and let's look at it from a different angle.
It's funny. My fire's in the zone of balance, right? My water is higher than my fire. It's just north of balance. And then my air is higher than all of that. And like you, my earth is well, low. I'll be polite and I'll call my earth low. I believe you've called it non-existent, which is, also true.
It's there somewhere.
It's there. 30,000 assessments. One guy has the all-time lowest score. I win. That being said, when I'm in sales or business development mode, I'm in fire mode, right? That fire energy to go out and get people dialed in and have the conversations. And it's so often that I'll send a message, text, email, LinkedIn, voicemail, whatever. And then I'll have to go back and say, oh, and by the way, how are you doing today? Right? Because like
Yep.
that fire trumps all of the energies that I bring to the table. And it's really interesting to the point where I've gotten like that, we all have that itchy thumb in text messaging. It's like, okay, done typing, send. Where I'm like, okay, try reading the message just once before hitting that send button so you can, not come off as so incredibly self-serving. I'll end up like post-editing a message and take the line that was at the end and move it to the top because that's actually where it should have gone. Because, we are our own biggest source of frustration when we start to really dial into how we're showing up.
One of the things, and I'm gonna point out, Sarah put a comment in the chat. If you're a fire, befriend a water and ask them to be your barometer. Really good at doing that when we're given the permission to check you on your blazing fast crazy. That's a great piece of advice. And the reality is part of it, I do like that. Part of it is too, is this is part of the reason why I really love behavioral elements because it creates a safe language. So this is something that I do is if I'm working with my team and we have a meeting, I might ask somebody, hey, was I too fire in that meeting? Was I being a little too air in that meeting? Or that I have somebody on my team that really feels actually my entire team feels pretty comfortable putting me in check. I saw Madison on here. She was probably giggling at that, but hey, Jay, why don't you back the fire up a little bit? We need a little time to think through this. But then it doesn't feel as personal. It feels like, oh, that's really just my energy, my drive that's coming through. It's not a personal attack on Jay. It's just how Jay shows up with his fire element. So that can be, I do like that, blazing fast, crazy. So that is an awesome way to do that as well. The other way, and if you don't have somebody in there, this is a tactic I love sharing with leaders because we all have some form of a preference. Some people are more balanced than others. But if you find yourself leaning too far into one of the elements of the others, this is a strategy that I have adopted. I literally ask myself a question on all four of the elements if I'm going forward with something. How would an air respond to this? How would an earth respond to this? How would a water respond to this? And the reason is we have all four elements. It's just how much we lean into those elements or how much they influence us. So if I can take a step back and actually empathize with the other elements, that has also really improved my decision making in the way that I show up for my team.
Yeah, and the way you communicate the message, right? You kind of soften it or harden it. And for me, it's interesting because, behavior ends up being so situational, right? So we have to kind of map out who is this person being in this moment. Yeah, we have all four drives, but one of them is going to spike depending on the task we're doing, right? I mentioned sales being a fiery moment for me, right? Whereas writing's much more of an air moment for me. I'd like to pretend it's an earth moment, but we've already discussed that.
Yeah, I see Elizabeth put in a chat. I always ask if I was overbearing or pushy. And that's the thing is for some people, they may perceive that to be like if you and I were sitting in a conversation, Elizabeth, and maybe you were really direct or you were, really driving forward some kind of idea, I might not perceive that as overbearing and pushy based on my elements. I'm like, oh yeah, she was just really passionate about it or pushing that forward. Whereas somebody else on the team may look at it. And that's really where leadership comes into this is thinking about all four elements and how they're represented on our teams. And that's one of the reasons why it's really valuable to kind of get to know like where is this person showing up? I know, and I was actually speaking with a colleague this morning, very, very high earth, one of our behavioral elements certified guides. And I've had conversations with him in the past. I know I can drive him absolutely crazy because I'll jump from one topic to the next topic to the next topic, and then all of a sudden find myself like in a conversation all by myself. Like they're still evaluating that first topic. So it's much better when we're actually sitting there and recalling, hey, this person sitting across from me is an earth, and they're going to want some time to think through this. They're going to want some time to analyze this. They're going to want some time to poke holes in it and ask questions about it. And if I approach either my sales, my leadership, or anything like that in that regard, it's always going to give that space for better connection and collaboration with the other elements. What have you done from a leadership capacity, Terry? How would you say that you remind yourself to kind of take a step back? Because I know you do, and I know you can. I've seen you do it. How do you remind yourself to really kind of stay in the moment and say, all right, my air can definitely swirl me out of control, but what do I do to kind of keep myself more or less in balance?
I really take a look at who I'm talking to, right? And remember that the value isn't in what I'm saying as much as it is what they get from what I'm saying. So if I'm speaking just from my perspective, I'm probably either going to A, lose them, B, bore them, C, maybe fire them up and get them excited, or D, just completely miss the mark. So really taking the time to understand, and this is true whether on stage in front of a couple of hundred people or just one to one. I wrote a post about this conversation that we were going to have yesterday, and in the preface, I said leadership is like teaching, right? One size doesn't fit all, right? Just like we have multiple learning modalities and we understand that people learn differently, we need to understand that people need to be communicated with and led differently. So always trying to reframe it from the listener's perspective is my go-to hack. And I've argued for the last 10 years that we no longer simply listen with our ears. With the amount of stuff we read, we have to listen with our eyes now too.
Absolutely. When we think about a good leader, they're really going to be able to help somebody fulfill all four of the drives, right? Like, let's think about a leader maybe that helps you acquire the drive to acquire our fire element. Well, I've seen a lot of people leave positions, even though they were well paid, they had great benefits package, and they were, they had all the money coming in, but that wasn't enough to satisfy essentially the other drives. That wasn't enough to overcome a lack of feeling of bonding or a lack of feeling of growing or a lack of stability and certainty. So when we think and when we approach leadership, one of the things that, we really try to push to people is when we have an emotional reaction to it, oftentimes that's a pretty good indicator that one of our drives is not being fulfilled or is being pushed against. Think about it. Almost any emotion that we end up having can relate back to one of those drives. Maybe we're frustrated because our voice isn't getting heard and, we're not feeling connected or affiliated. Or maybe we're frustrated because we're not sure what to do and nobody's explaining it. We have that drive to defend pop up. So, from a leadership perspective, getting people to essentially step out of their own comfort zone, right? Like giving somebody that's a fire tasks, probably not going to elevate their growth, but giving them tasks and helping them stay on track or helping them to connect with other people, that's going to fulfill those other drives as well.
Do you do that subliminally, or do you do that like, and maybe covertly is a better way? Like, you know what you're doing, but they don't really know what you're doing? Or is it important to actually explain why you're doing it, why it matters, so they can actually see themselves potentially in a different light?
I think that it's probably a little bit more overt with me, especially within my own team because we do have obviously my whole team is very up to date on behavioral elements. So for us, I talk about like when we do our team sprints, it's as much about bonding and connecting, and we create space and time for that as it is about learning or developing a new skill or brainstorming or strategizing. So we do try to create our balance when we're doing those different aspects. Or, like, for example, when I'm meeting with my leadership team, we always start with what's your big win for the week? And it can be personal or it can be professional, just to create that connection. So I think that there's some intentionality that comes in there. Sometimes it's like, hey, we need to focus on, we need to focus on stability and certainty because maybe we've let that go for a little while. So we need to put some processes and systems into place. We need to lean into our earth. When I'm working with somebody that maybe is not as familiar with behavioral elements, maybe there it's a little bit more covert until they really get a good grasp onto the different elements. But I think as somebody that has taken the assessment, it really is something that you could probably take a step back and say, hey, how am I making my decisions? Am I making my decisions consistent with this, or should I be trying to find more balance? How am I managing my communication strategies? Am I really being very focused and direct, or am I creating balance and making sure that there is some level of connection and bonding? So I would say that it's both ways in either scenario with intention, but sometimes I don't want to call it a little bit more hidden, but maybe it's just not as overt that I'm talking fire and water until they get the concepts of it. Does that make sense?
It does, right? And it's because it's kind of important to not blur the message with a bunch of definitions that they don't already know, because you want the action to happen even sometimes before the understanding of why it matters. So that's why I asked, right? You don't have to sit down and explain everything to someone to get them to do the thing. Sometimes they'll just do it because you asked, or they need to do it. It's their job, man. So I appreciate that. I really like the shared language piece. Right. I've been in some companies, whether they were taking the Enneagram or the Big Five or other assessments, where like even on their nameplates, they'll have the symbol. But I don't necessarily know, especially like in an Enneagram or a Myers-Briggs, when there's 9 or 16 different types, that being able to categorize all of those and instantly relate to all of them is as simple. Whereas I think of water, earth, fire, and air, right? Not only am I familiar with those things in my everyday world, I can actually see those things in people's behavior, sometimes in their dress, how they speak, the words they use. And I think that's such an easier path. But once you get that structure in, like you said, hey, back that fire down, Jay. It becomes such a, again, I go back to shared meaning. It becomes such a better tool for building culture, for building understanding, for creating more insightful and I'm trying to think of the right word, just the right communication strategies.
Well, I think it's important too, because when we think about a lot of the other assessments, which I love, I'm certified in so many of the different ones. They really often are helping us to better understand the how and what of leadership as opposed to the why. And that's really where I think that behavioral elements comes in a nice place, is it helps us understand the why behind our decisions and what is motivating us to those different directions. Let's take a turn here though, Terry, and think about how about leading up? You know, a lot of people, maybe you are in a leadership position, maybe you do have direct reports and you're managing them. You know, we've talked a lot about being able to match our communication style or to be able to think and say, all right, how can I step into how can I step into making sure that my team's supported and feels comfortable and that their drives are being balanced and fulfilled? But what about those instances where we have to lead up? And maybe we have a boss, or maybe even leading up to a client if you're a solopreneur and you have to do something to sort of correct a pathway or to change a direction. How would you take maybe your knowledge of the elements and think about that in terms of strategies for leading up? And maybe the person doesn't know the behavioral elements as well as you do. What do you think?
Well, in that situation, I hope they don't, right? If I'm trying to lead up, right? Because they'll be like, "Hey, I see what you're doing, sunshine." No, I like the idea of leading up. In fact, quick story: I was 29 years old, moving back to Detroit from Columbus, Ohio, and I had owned my own recruiting business for a couple of years. And I met with an organizational psychologist, and I said, I'm frustrated because I'm going to go back and work for somebody. He's like, why? Why is that a problem? I said, I don't like to be managed. And he's like, well, this is simple. Manage your manager. And I said, what does that mean? How do you do that? And he said, understand what their priorities are, what matters to them, what they need from you, and give it to them before they ask. And then you don't have to worry about ever feeling managed. I was like, wow, that's great advice. And so similar, when you understand the behavior of your boss and what matters to them, you can actually speak in their language to either show them that you're doing what needs to be done or convince them on this new idea that you want to try by sharing, the results or the impact that it's going to create in the language that actually is going to move them to bless your operation.
Yeah, to that point. And it's so interesting because when I was working at Wayne State University, one of my mentors and somebody who I have a ton of respect for, and I realized that this was before behavioral elements was developed. He was very high earth and very high air. Like there's no doubt in my mind, every day was a new priority to this is your number one priority today. This is your number one priority today. Till I had like 17 number one priorities. And it was like playing whack-a-mole trying to figure out which was the priority that I was going to get not yelled at, but which was the priority that was going to be the priority today that I was going to get called to task on. But then there was also sort of a lot of that earth of they wanted the detailed instructions and detailed, analysis of where we're at and this and this and this and this. So it was such an interesting, and I did this naturally, but at one point in time, I sat down with them, I guess maybe even just naturally understanding how their brain worked. And I sat down with them and I had all 17 of the priorities that I had been assigned over the last 2 weeks. And I flat out asked, I said, these are the 17 priorities that you have me working on. Each of them has been a number one priority given a day. I want to walk through these and say, which ones do you really want me to focus my energy and attention on? Because I can't do all 17 at the same time. So you give me your priorities. But when I structured them out and I looked at the deadlines and I looked at the urgency and I looked at the importance, he was then able to actually say, okay, this one is put this one on top of here, put this one here, put this one here, put this one here. So then the next time that he came and he was also like, where are we at with this project? You have already said that this is my priority. I'm going to focus on this, get this task done before I move on to the next task. Would you like to shift the priority list again? And usually it would be a no, I don't want to shift the priority list. Okay, perfect. Now I'm not having a 30-minute conversation. I'm not getting, I'm not working on one thing and then chasing my tail somewhere else. But that was an example before behavioral elements of me saying that's not my working style, but how am I going to adapt and manage this approach? Because otherwise I'm going to burn out. I'm going to get frustrated. I'll probably quit. So that's one way that I've found in leading up is using those elements in the same way of this is how this person's brain thinks. Let's put it all on a piece of paper. Let's let them logically structure it and then allow me to kind of take my actions in going forward. Had that person been
Did
a
you
fire, I would have probably taken a different approach.
did you get to a point where they stopped coming for the check-ins at some point because they just trusted that you were doing the things that they had ordered the way they did?
Yeah, and that was another thing that I realized is when I was getting micromanaged, and I will say that I felt micromanaged in the very first part of working in that environment. And I started to realize that things that were creating this condition for micromanagement had nothing to do with me, had nothing to do with my performance. And it was actually when I recognized that and stepped back from that that it allowed me to strategize a way to move forward on it. And what I ultimately did was, why was this person doing that? And I can tell you, part of it was past experience where somebody hadn't completed the tasks in the way that they wanted. Sometimes it wasn't that this person didn't always give clear instructions or expectations. So then they followed up on every single piece of it. So I started to learn, like when a project was starting, to ask more questions, to get more details, to really dig into that person's air, earth brain and pull out what is it about this that really matters to you as my leader. So then that way I can communicate in advance. Here's where we're at. This is what our numbers are. This is what this looks like. This is the barriers, and this is where we're going. I will get, and this is so important for anybody that's leading up. If you can figure out, and this strategy works in a number of different places. If you can figure out what it is that the person's looking for, and you can set a timeline to say, here's where today's Monday. This is where we're at. I will give you your next update on Wednesday. What you're actually doing is pulling the uncertainty out. More than likely, they're not going to ask you on Tuesday. They'll be looking for that update on Wednesday, but now they're not going to come back to you 7 times in between because you've already established clarity of when you're going to give them the next update or when the next appropriate time is for that update. So if you're
I
able
agree,
to
sir.
pick what matters and then set your own timelines, that's how you can communicate and lead up and make sure that you're not getting the micromanaging or the things that's pulling you off. And thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that.
Do you ask if that timeline is acceptable, or do you just say, "This is the timeline"?
I think that that's up to you and a negotiation, right? Like if I know that this is really mission critical, I'm going to give you a daily update at 9 a.m. every morning. Not much is going to happen over the next 8 hours. You'll get your next update there. But if they say, hey, can you give me one in the morning and one in the afternoon? If that's going to keep them from coming to my office or making phone calls or sending me 14 emails 6 times during the day, have we had any movement? Have we had any movement? Then that's a price I'm willing to pay in that negotiation. If there's an instance where I look at it and say, hey, I'm going to give you an update by the end of the week, unless these triggers happen, in which case I will update you sooner. Because then at that point in time, if I'm predicting and I'm leading up again, recognizing what are those priorities, that is a concept that I would look at and say, these are the important things to this person. If these triggers occur, you'll get an update sooner, but otherwise, plan to hear back on Friday. And that's going to give me the space I need to be less structured or feeling like I'm being put into that box.
And it goes back to setting realistic expectations, right? And someone mentioned earlier about the uncertainty. Just having that conversation reduces it to almost, I don't want to say nothing, but it lowers it so much that they know that you're working on it, you're handling it, you're doing the thing that needs to happen. And when not even time permits, but when it's the right time, the update's gonna come. So yeah, I that's such an important concept.
But I mean, that's one of those things where recognizing what our leaders' elements might be is going to give you that idea. Just like you said, we can match the communications. So for me, in a lot of cases, my team might communicate, Jay, this is how we're going to win. This is how this is going to be a brand new idea that's going to break us into X, Y, and Z. That's going to appeal to me with my fire and air. If I take that and I would have taken, hey, this is how we're going to win to our earth and air, to my earth and air boss, that probably wouldn't have gone the same way. Or if my leader was high in water, this is how the team's going to win. And this is how everybody's going to be included in this. And this is how everybody's going to really grow and develop from this. And being able to frame our communications in that way can be a really powerful connection piece that's going to say, okay, yep, Jay, take your time. This is going to definitely help the team out. That's worth the investment.
Yeah, it goes back to that relatability factor, right? If you're trying to, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a sales presentation, a leadership opportunity, dealing with your boss, dealing with your spouse, right? You have to figure out how to relate the information in a way that's going to motivate them. And knowing that element of theirs, it helps, right? It's almost prescriptive.
Yep. And even if you're an entrepreneur out there and maybe you're the solopreneur and you're the boss of your own company and everything else like that, you still have that opportunity to lead up when you're interacting with clients, right? Like a lot of times we feel pressure from a client. The client, is paying the bill, therefore they're sort of the boss. But in many cases, if we take that opportunity to really understand that client and say, hey, what is their priority? What is their element? How is that showing up? What is it that I can do to sort of head that off at the past, or what is it that I can do to really earn that trust? And that's a lot of what leadership is it's earning trust. And we earn trust by essentially connecting with people in a meaningful way. If we're able to understand their motivations and their drives, we can really connect with them in a meaningful way. And that's whether you're leading up, down, sideways, diagonal, in whatever direction, being able to sort of bring that to the space. Terry, when you've looked at, let's just say leaders in general, we won't put a name or a face to this, but when you've looked at leadership in general, what have some of the biggest challenges you've seen from leadership behaviors? What behaviors have you seen leaders do? And, what is it that maybe, if you were to call it leadership watchouts, what would you say?
I think the biggest one that most leaders I've seen, whether they're the owner or the executive in an organization, is expecting them from their staff.
Mm,
Right. And so the challenge really is it's hard when they're looking at you driving around in your fancy car, heading to your fancy home and hopping on your nice boat. And they're trying to figure out, am I going to pay the heating bill or am I going to pay for groceries this week? And there's such a disconnect just fundamentally from where we are. And the leader's mad because they're not putting the effort in that the leader probably put in 20 years before to get to that spot. And it's an interesting thing. So they come across very differently. So, I go back to this idea of empathy and where some leaders lack that understanding. And then again, just the basic communication that one size fits all is the other big challenge. You're not going to motivate me the same way they could motivate you, right?
yeah.
What drives you and what drives me are different. And not totally, we're similar enough, but it's what I care about and what someone that's an earth person cares about are exceedingly different. Right?
Yeah.
So don't use the same language with us because you're not going to get the expected or desired result.
Well, and going back to what you said, sometimes, and I've seen this happen too, is where a leader has a lot of trust with their team, a lot of empathy for their team, a lot of influence with their team, and they're not even asking their team to match their energy, but the team feels an obligation to match their energy. And that's a blind spot, I think, especially like leaders who are really, really liked can oftentimes have that sort of call it, sort of influence that all of a sudden people feel, "Oh, I got to do this. I got to do this for my leader because that leader really takes care of me, or this is good to me, has done this." A good leader is going to kind of be reflective on that and saying, is my team doing too much to satisfy me or to follow or to this or that or the other thing? Do I need to help my team set healthy boundaries? And actually, and I'm going to give Madison credit. She's here today. Madison helped me see this in myself because one of the things with my travel and everything else, I was sending emails and it'd be 9 o'clock at night, and I had zero expectation that a team was going to respond to me at 9 o'clock, 9:30, or anything else like that. I'm actually at 5 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning the next day sending out that email. And I realized I didn't understand that at the moment, but Madison helped me to understand, hey, we feel an obligation. We want to do this. We want to support. And when you're sending an email at 9 o'clock, it feels like it's kind of stepping on some of those boundaries. And I'm like, great. So I've had clear communications on that, but I also really try to either schedule my emails to come out at, 9 Eastern time as opposed to being sent at, 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm somewhere in Europe or something like that. So sometimes it's even just kind of I think a good leader is going to have safety for teams to step in and point out those gaps and to make sure that we're not over influencing or that we're doing something because, like I said, I had no intentionality behind that, but I didn't understand what impact I was creating in that scenario.
I love that example. And I love the fact that you talked about the idea of scheduling. I've seen emails from people that talk about, hey, just because I'm sending this at weird hours, I have no expectation of you replying at weird hours. And I used to do that with my team all the time. I'm like, listen, I work when I work, man. And if I'm fired up about something, you're going to get a message from me at 11:30 at night. That does not mean that I care about your response for the next 12 hours, right? Just know that if I've got something on my mind, you're going to get it, but you are not obligated to respond to it in any sort of timely fashion. Um, I like this idea and I like this conversation because I think it's so important and illustrates the differences. I wonder how many leaders you've met, seen, actually have done that self-reflection and understand that piece. And then I want to jump into a conversation about what you're really kind of talking about here is feedback and how do we open the doors to receive more of that? Because I think that's how we grow as individuals, as leaders, as teams.
Yeah, and I'll hit on that. So, audience, if you do have questions or if there's any topics or areas that you'd like us to cover, I know that we only have about 15 minutes left or so. So I want to make sure that we get your questions answered if there is something specific. But I'm loving the conversation too, Terry. You know, I think as leaders, uh, I think that one of the things that gets into the way of some of that self-perception is the priorities that we set for ourselves. So a leader, let's take a water leader whose highest level of priority is the team and people's comfort and the connection that people have. If they're not cautious or if they're not careful, they start to see everything through just that lens. And maybe you do have the fire on the team that's saying, yeah, it's great, it's all kumbaya here, but where is my opportunity to earn more money? Or where's my opportunity to get X, Y, and Z? When we come at things from a particular lens, I think that it's a little harder sometimes to maybe see the other side. So, whereas I'm a fire and it was difficult for me to see how I was burning my team out, that goes the opposite way too. If I'm in earth, I may be looking at this and saying, but I'm structuring this and setting this up for your success. I'm doing this because I care about you. But somebody that's kind of in that space that's not an earth, that's not how they're seeing it. They're seeing it as you are so rules focused and strict and not giving me space to innovate or grow that this is sort of dampening. So do leaders get it? I think so. I think sometimes though it really does come down to creating the conditions for open feedback and to say like my team whenever I do one-to-ones with them, my last question is, how can I show up and be a better leader for you? And I've gotten some of the absolute best feedback. And that's because I've created safety. They're allowed to pick on me or tell me. I know I have huge flaws, and I'm always trying to grow and learn from those. And if you create that sort of sense of learning, like this isn't an attack. This is, I want you to be as comfortable as I am, but I need to grow in order to do that. You need to grow in order to do that. So how are we going to do that together? I won't know if I'm not told.
So you've already mentioned that your air is pretty high. And so that drive to learn is going to show up and you're going to learn about yourself as much as you have curiosity about, the wonders of the world. What about someone who's an earth who may not have that same drive to learn, but has that drive to defend and maintain the status quo? Do you see a difference in how they might approach the idea of receiving feedback?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have learned, and this is a great strategy for people who are not necessarily awesome at receiving feedback, because that's honestly a skill. Receiving feedback and giving good feedback, big skill to develop from a leadership perspective. If I find somebody that's maybe like a little more on the drive to defend, one of the things that I think about is what, and let me walk through this for just a second. What is their North Star? Okay, we know that Earth's structure is often, kind of, I don't want to say hierarchical, but to an extent it can be hierarchical. So if say you and I are, say you and I are having a discussion and I want to give you feedback and you're really high Earth and maybe not necessarily open to it, but we're both here on this behavioral element stage. I might say, Terry, in interest of making behavioral elements more efficient, could I offer you a little feedback that would maybe help put us on that productive path? And at that point in time, behavioral elements becomes the North Star. It's not about you, Terry. It's about us making this program more efficient. And I've got an idea to how to do so. So maybe you don't want to learn. Maybe that's not your drive, but you do want things to be more efficient, more productive, more functional. So I'm going to position that North Star above and beyond whatever that sort of individual. So using that hierarchy structure can oftentimes open space to have a conversation. I really like this in a number of different places. Like if we're doing a deep dive and a cultural discussion, and I know that it's going to be tense, I'll often have teams do what are 5 truths that everybody in this room would agree with. And I'll have them write them out on sticky notes. And then we will literally spend the first half hour coming up with what are 5 things that everybody in this room agrees with. Once we get that sort of 5 truths on the board, those become the North Star. Like, hey, if everybody in a room wants this, feels this, sees this, then any kind of feedback or communication is clearly not personal. It's all in the interest of getting to those 5 truths. And it helps take some of that personal out of the space. Does that make sense?
100%. And I think that's such a valuable thing, right? Because when we're together approaching a mission, right, we can take that personal bias or intrigue out of it, and we're focused on this over here. So it feels less like a potential attack.
Mhm.
Right. And so I was chatting with a gentleman earlier today, and his name of his company was ExecuSpect. And so I was like, "Ooh, I like that. Is that, executive plus inspect, expect, well, it wasn't perspective, expectation, and he's like, it's perspective. It's about leadership perspective. And I was like, that's so great because we have to remember that there are so many perspectives that aren't ours. And we've got to do our best to look through other people's lenses from time to time to really get that understanding. So I like that idea of shifting the perspective. This isn't about me, this is about where we're going. And that lessens any potential ill feeling. At least I believe it would.
If you're going to give me painful feedback, but tell me how that's going to help us win or help us innovate something new, I'm going to be open to it. If it's one of those where it feels like that feedback doesn't really have a purpose or an impact to it, I'm probably not going to have as good of a response or reaction to it. So I try to listen in terms of making sure that I'm being thoughtful about, how I'm showing up or where are some of the gaps in my own perception. But realistically, feedback for me is most valuable when it tells me, how can I take this and help the team win? How are we going to take this and move this forward? So we're
Love
here
it.
at the end of our time today, Terry. If you were to wrap this up with a nice bow, what are some, what is maybe 1 or 2 things that you would offer? How can you build your leadership, or what are some of those key aspects, kind of takeaways that our audience would walk away with of developing themselves as a leader or developing their team's leadership skills?
Focus on your communication, right? And communicate from their perspective, not just yours. Sure, it's important to get your message out, but if your message doesn't relate to them and explain why it's gonna relate to them, I feel like you're missing out. We gotta connect the dots more effectively. And then remember that you have all the things you need inside of you right now to be a leader. All you have to do is choose to step up. The world is way short on good leadership right now, and we really need you to do so.
Love that. And that's where from that communication aspect, ask those questions. How would a water want to hear this message? How would an earth want to hear this message? How would an air want to hear this message? How would a fire want to hear this message? And lean into that empathy to be able to create that message and that connection. The kind of parting thought that I would offer is, from a leadership perspective, make a list of all of the different things that you do, for your team, for your organization, for your project. Make a list and quantify the different tasks. Is this a task that fulfills the drive to acquire, our fire element? Is this a task that fulfills the drive to defend, our earth element, our drive to bond, our water element, our drive to learn, our air element, and see what kind of balance you're actually creating? Because I think a good leader is going to help their team acquire resources, win, be competitive, find mastery, all sort of towards the fire. They're going to help our team feel stable, they're secure, have certainty and predictability, our earth. They're going to have opportunities to connect. They're going to provide opportunities to bond and affiliate with the people that are around them. And a good leader is going to help people learn and grow, our air element. So a good leader is going to help people find balance. Make sure that the tasks that you're doing or the projects that you're taking on or the initiatives that you are really leaning into that balance space. And I think that that's going to help you and your organization, whether you're leading up or down, to really establish good leadership.
And you know what, I want to add to that because, historically, companies are so focused on that drive to acquire that those other three things get missed over. And, study after study after study shows that while salary and pay is important, the ability to learn, the ability to grow, the ability to get along with team members are right there in the top five too. So let's not forgo the three just to support the one. That's an excellent point, Jay.
So, well, thank you, audience, for joining us on this month's Lunch and Learn About Leadership. You can always connect with Terry and I. If you do have further questions or want to dig in deeper, we're always here to help. But hopefully you've enjoyed this conversation. We will get this posted up to YouTube. So if you ever do want to go back to it and see anything, you can always see our smiling faces. So thanks for joining today. And thank you, Terry, for a wonderful conversation on behavioral elements and leadership.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.